Okay. Hi, people. This is going to be a somewhat longer lecture, so sit back, make sure you have a sheet of paper in front of you with a pen, and be prepared to pause and stop for a few seconds while you acclimate the information in your head. So I'm going to try and keep it down short and simple. But again, any time you get a question, let me know. So now I am in the teacher instructor portion of Schoology, so your screen will look slightly different when you open up the files. Okay. So it's important, first of all, that you have a multi-tab concept open so that you can open the Riddle, Lament, Apocalyptic Genre document under Thursday of last week. Also, you'll want to open both files of The Wife's Lament, these two translations, one by Dr. Aaron Hostetter and one by Ann Stanford. So I'll be juggling between these three. So first, I'm moving to the Riddle Lament category. When you think of The Wife's Lament, the title is preparing you for the genre of a lament, just by the name itself. Okay. Interesting enough, which makes the criticism more interesting for me at any rate, the same qualities that define a riddle can be applied to The Wife's Lament. So depending on your leaning of interpretation, you could say it's a riddle, you could say it's a lament. In this particular case, the poem is in first person, which is the first item under both categories. Furthermore, both have themes of grief, or both can have themes of grief in isolation. Primarily, there's a theme of confusion and inquiry that is available in The Wife's Lament. It is a slightly disorganized piece of work, partly because the page itself, in the actual historic page in the Book of Exeter, is damaged. So translators have to make some guesses here and there about word choices. But otherwise, in particular, if you follow the lament definition, the poem does fit nicely into this category. There is little room for controversy, but it does work well as a riddle poem if you just look at it in a slightly different fashion. So this is where the lens choice is important. Furthermore, if you read it, it is vague in some areas of the poem. Because it's non-narrative, meaning it doesn't have a specific storyline embedded, and there's a limited backstory provided, you got a lot of ambivalent history in the piece. It is vague. It is cryptic. It lends to a strange, surreal logic of the world. Okay? So, either way you look at it, when we go over the poem, it can be considered riddle or a lament. So let me point out something really quick. If you look at the Dr. Aaron Hostetter's translation first, he is going to treat it as a riddle. So the first thing to keep in mind, you have a male translator. What we're going to end up doing, and this is where it can get a little heavy-handed and a little confusing. Your lens choice will affect your interpretation of his interpretation of the poem. So remember, it's written in Old English. He's translating it into modern English. He is using a lens of his own choosing. So what you have is the critic, you. The critic's picking a lens and viewing the translator's interpretation that's using a lens, which is looking at the piece, original poem, which is written with a lens. Okay, and that's where you can have a lot of speculation and a lot of discussion and argument. Okay, positive argument. Okay, so let's read the first few lines of Hofstadter. Then I'm going to switch over to Stanford's. In this case, the first line itself says, I rack this riddle about myself, full miserable, my very own experience. Okay, so again, it's going to open up with riddle. His intentional word choice is promoting the poem as a riddle. In addition, this word rack, that means confusion, chaos, dilapidation. So the narrator, the I voice, who the instant you see that I pronoun, you have to question reliability. You have to ask yourself what she is saying about herself when it's stated, I rack this riddle about myself. It goes on, I can speak it, what I endured in misery after I was grown, both new and old, none greater than now. Always I suffered the torment of my racked ways. So if you pick up here, you got suffering, you've got misery, and torment. She is aware and knowledgeable that she is her own worst enemy. So in other words, by his translation, she's suffering, paying penance, if you want to put it in those terms, paying penance for the torment of her ways of chaos and ways of disorder. Okay. As a result, you got a male translator producing this lament, or this riddle version of a lament. When you go to Stanford's, on the other hand, and I make that larger, she doesn't call it a riddle. She's going to call it a song. Again, she's the Anne Stanford, a female, is opening it up with the pronoun I. I make this song about me, full sadly, my own wayfaring. I, a woman, tell what griefs I had since I grew up, new or old, never more than now. Ever I know the dark of my exile. Just a slight shift in the diction, she's putting a different emphasis on the theme. Whereas the male, Hofstadter, is making the poem a riddle, Stanford is making the poem strictly a lament. We're dealing with these feelings of sadness, wayfaring, grief. And even the last line is putting the emphasis more on an exile and the problems of the exile, but by the nature of how it's worded, this event that's being placed upon her is not her own doing. Okay, she's not in control of the situation. Whereas when you look at Hofstadter's, she is in control and she's aware of her control, all by the slight alteration and just the vernacular of the speaker. You can get a lot of interesting analysis when you compare translations side by side. So back with the Hofstadter, the second stanza, my Lord departed at first from his tribe here over the tossing of waves. I watched a sorrow at dawn, wondering where in these lands my chieftain might be. The situation she's found herself, the narrator, it's agreed, is a peace weaver. She's been forced to marry into a family not of her background, not of her original community. She feels lonely and lost among these people. Her husband, who is a chieftain, high-ranking individual, probably a king, has left the area. He's overseas, leaving the female character grieving, lonely, lost. The exile she could be in at this point could be given to her from her blood family, her kin. Then the next stanza says, they insinuated the kinsman of that man by secret thought to separate us two, so that we two, widest apart in the worldly realm, should live most hatefully, and it harrowed me. The circumstances here, the king's family, his court, his followers, did not like her. So through gossip and ill words and basically making up stories off the top of their heads, they put a division between the king and his peace-weaving wife. As a consequence, the king ordered me to take this grove for a home. The narration is assuming, what you have here is an assumption, that you are standing next to the woman, or you're in the same vicinity of the woman, and she is talking directly to you, from the Hofstadter translation. Okay. You are in the vicinity of a grove. She is in a place where a land with almost no loyal friends. Keep in mind, in this case, it's almost no loyal friends. Her misery is going to compound. Therefore, my mind so miserable that I met a well-suited man for myself, so misfortunate, and mind sorrowing, thought kept close, plotting a crime. The language Hofstadter's using is slightly fragmented. It's fractured in a sense. But you can get the idea. She's miserable, and because she's alone, her husband has gone overseas, she's found another man to pay attention to her. The unfortunate part is he is plotting a crime. And this is where the language is more vague than the other portions of the poem. The plotting a crime, you don't know if it's implying it's strictly the man she's met, or it's herself who's plotting the crime, or if they're both plotting a crime. Again, that's where the interpretation of the reader kicks in, and you, using the concept that you're trying to solve a riddle, you try to piece this together from your own interpretation and the lens of choice that you're using. To return to the Stanford version, again, you have the Lord being introduced. And let me point out, there's little discrepancy as far as the verbiage between the two poems. It's the manner in which the diction is handled where Stanford is shifting it for developing stronger sympathy towards this narrator. Another thing to keep in mind, we don't know the author of the piece. A woman could have written this poem. If that is the case, and a woman's writing this with this heavy, strong, emotional perspective, one would have stronger sympathy for the character, and it becomes less of a riddle and more of a lamentation. Whereas, if you consider the male translation, he is leaning more to making the female a villain in the whole story. He's blaming her for the consequences of the actions within the poem. Stanford, on the other hand, is making it seem she is a victim of circumstance. So in this stanza, we have, first my Lord went away from his people over the wave tumult. I grieved each dawn, wandered where my Lord, my first on earth, might be. Notice the subtle wording, my Lord, my first on earth might be. This is her first husband. The logic of this statement is showing that she has considered more than the first. Then I went forth, a friendless exile, to seek service in my sorrow's need. My man's kinsmen began to plot by darkened thought to divide us two, so we, most wildly in the world's kingdom, lived wretchedly, and I suffered longly. Again, this is promoting the suffrage and her dissatisfaction in the marriage. Now, in the Stanford case, the wording is less vague in as far as the king's actions. My Lord commanded me to move my dwelling here. I had few loved ones in this land or faithful friends. For this my heart grieves, that I should find the man well matched to me, hard of fortune, mournful of mind, hiding his mood, thinking of murder. These last four lines in this section are more fragmented and more fractured. But they're promoting the notion that she has found a man well matched to her situation. And he is hiding his mood. He's hiding his thoughts of murder. Stanford purposely chose the word murder, whereas, remember, with Hofstadter, he basically chose the word crime, right there, plotting a crime. Okay. Moving forward with Hofstadter, the wife is going to make a comment about this new, different relationship. Yes, she is seeing a man out of her marriage. So, because we don't know the full circumstances, we don't know if she is seen as a cheater on her husband or if she is just casually talking to another individual who she just happened to meet. Okay? Regardless of that, she says, we vowed quite often that none but death could separate us. That statement as well, notice the verbiage is echoing the notion of a wedding vow. Going by the evidence as it's applied to you at this moment, it seems to be in addition to her marriage. So she's in the male translation, it seems she's cheating on her husband. Shifting back to Stanford, on the other hand, Stanford said, "Blithe was our bearing, often we vowed, that but death alone would part us to naught else." In this case, it's the one time I feel that the narrator seems more in control of her situation, and she's choosing this man, and they are vowing to stay together. It's more passionate, more emotional. She feels a connection with this other individual. As a lament, and looking at the situation here, I actually personally feel I would have done the same thing. If my partner had abandoned me, left me alone, with no connections in a strange country, strange location, I would look for someone to comfort me. And that's what it comes down to. You're trying to find solace in someone to add to your life and make you feel less lonely, which is what the narrator has done. Now notice Stanford uses the word friendship. So whether or not it's heightened into a more sexual arrangement, that's hinted at. You can infer it, but there's nothing definite placed here. She says, I must far and near bear the anger of my beloved. The man sent me out to live in the woods, under an oak tree, in this den in the earth. From this concept, this translation, it seems the second man has forced her to live in a secondary location. It is ancient, this earth hall. It's like a cave. It's like a dirt house. She's complaining about the dilapidation, and she's left for a second time. She's been abandoned, and she's all longing. The valleys are dark, the hills high, the yard overgrown bitter with briars, a joyless dwelling. So from the husband and the second individual, she's living even more further away from any society. She's totally alone at this point. Hostetter has her complaining about the loss of her husband, the original first. My husband ordered me anchored in a woody grove under an oak tree, within this earthen cave. Ancient is the earth hall. I am entirely longing. So the shift here to the phrase my husband is continuing the story that the husband has abandoned her and forced her to a certain location, and she has this man on the side. Dark are the valleys, the mountains so lofty, bitter these hovels, which low-income housing, basically, shacks. Bitter these hovels, overgrown with thorns. Shelters without joy. So many times here the disappearance of my husband seizes me with stewing. So the phrase, the disappearance of my husband seizes me with a stewing, you could go either way with her emotional reaction. Stewing could imply anger and resentment, or it could be grieving, disappointment, and loneliness. So you've got anger on one side and depression and sadness on the other, and she's running between these two extremes. Okay, so it sounds like she's in a cave or a dirt house, like I said before. All my friends dwell in the dirt. I loved them while they lived, now guarding their graves. when I go forth alone in the darkness of daybreak under the oak tree outside this hallowed earth. Okay, now if this is a riddle, at this point, you could ask yourself what's being implied here. There's many ways of playing with this. What I like to say is she's actually been killed. The husband has put her aside, abandoned her, and the friendship, who's plotting a crime, has committed the crime of murder and has killed her and left her unburied. So she's placed in this cemetery, unburied, and her ghost is lingering, watching everything around her, but doesn't realize she's died. And of course, if she's cheated on her husband, then she wouldn't have access to heaven. This would be a strictly Catholic interpretation of a soap opera-like situation. So as it goes along, there I may, under this oak tree, by this cave, which in itself could represent a grave, an open grave, there I may sit a summer-long day where I can weep for my exiled path, my many miseries. Therefore I can never rest from these my mind's sorrowings, not from all these longings that seize me in my living. In this case, it encourages the fact she thinks she's alive. Okay, so I'm going to pause right there, go back to Stanford. Notice what she says here about the friends there are on earth, living beloved, lying in bed, while I at dawn am walking alone under the oak tree through these earth halls. Stanford shifted the language here. It's her friends in this case are not grave sites. Okay. She's looking in her past at the friends she's had, and now she's just wandering around alone, specifically around the oak tree. Again, it's going to repeat the information. There I may sit the summer-long day. There I can weep over my exile, my many hardships. Hence I may not rest from this care of heart which belongs to me ever, nor all this longing that has caught me in this life. So this section here, she's totally consumed by her depression. Okay. If you look at the closing stanzas, you have to ask yourself, is she angry, or is she angry and bitter, or is she sad and reflective? How much in power is she in her emotions? Is she passively just sitting there whining, for lack of a better word, about how sad her life is? Or, if you look at Hofstadter, is she bitter, angry, and spiteful at what her husband and this friend has done to her? Hofstadter broke let me do this differently. The Stanford one that remains is one stanza. Hofstadter has broken it into three stanzas. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hofstadter writes, a young man must always be sad at heart, hard in the thoughts inside. Also, he must keep a happy bearing, but also breast cares, suffering, never-ending grief. May he depend only upon himself for all his worldly pleasures. So it is a curse on other individuals, her husband and or the man she had the affair with. May he depend only upon himself for all his worldly pleasures. May he be stained with guilt far and wide throughout the lands of distant folk, so that my once friend, the guy, should sit under the stony cliffs, rimmed by storms, my weary-minded ally flowed around by waters in his dreary hall. So she's cursing him, saying his life should be as miserable as hers is. My former companion may know a great mind sorrow, remembering too often his joyful home. So in this case, the former companion, this stanza in particular leans stronger towards the husband. She's saying since he seems to be in exile himself, he's remembering what he's lost when he went away on his whatever errand that sent him on across the seas, as she stated. Woe be to that one who must wait for their beloved with longing. And what's interesting in this, the closing stanza, you don't know if she's referring to herself, to her friend, or to her husband. And that's where you get this interesting little confusing riddle. Like I mentioned before, is she a ghost, not knowing she's dead, sitting at her gravesite, just moaning and groaning about her infidelities in life? Or did the couple, herself and the friend, did they murder her husband? And then the second man, the murderer, the accomplice, abandoned her? Or again, was she exiled by the peace-weaving husband, found this other man, and he murdered her? There's a lot of conjecture here. It's that uncertainty that makes me like the piece even more. Okay. Let's look at Stanford's closing. May that young man be sad-minded always, hard his heart's thought, while he must wear a blithe bearing with care in the breast, a crowd of sorrows. Now, this wording makes it sound like the friend is younger than her husband and that he is being, she's wishing him or wishing that his life is sad like hers. May on himself depend all his world's joy. But be he outlawed far in a strange folk land, that my beloved sits under a rocky cliff rimmed with frost, a lord dreary in spirit, drenched with water in a ruined hall. So the Hoster implies that the house is not in disrepair, but in this case, she's paralleling her condition in a ruined hovel of a house and wishing that on her Lord, on her friend and the Lord. My Lord endures much care of mind. He remembers too often a happier dwelling. Woe be to them. And again, notice that plural pronoun. You're left wondering, is she throwing into the mix all three of them or just the two men figures, the male figures? Okay. So, using a gender argument, you can get a slightly different interpretation and defend this poem as a lament. Okay, looking at how the female views herself, views her life, and views the two men surrounding her. Whereas, when you look at the wife's lament here, using a psychological lens, you get more of an impression that she is feeling guilty for everything she has caused in her life. She has a severe, what's called ennui or loneliness, a major depression because she's made mistakes. There's less of a power manipulation in this case. The closing curse is a sudden shift in a power struggle. Let's say she gains some sense of control. She knows what she's done, and she's cursing the other men and putting it on them as well. However, with the Stanford, this is more wishing that the changes were different, that the putting a similar circumstance on the men, and they will learn their lesson. Now, the question is, does she want them to understand how she feels, sympathize with her, and come back to her? Does she want her husband to come and reclaim her and say he's sorry because he understands now what she feels? Or is she saying, go away from me, you've made my life miserable, and I hope you feel as miserable as me? Okay. So we had a discussion in the face-to-face class. One could, through the Stanford translation, I'll phrase it like that, through the Stanford translation, it's easier to see that this was written by a woman. It's interesting that the slight changes in diction shift the tone, shift the themes, and you get a stronger sense of the failings of being in this society, the failings of being a peace weaver. It isn't always going to be happy and with a firm resolution. Women at this time often were abandoned and forgotten and cast aside just because the man grew tired of them. Okay? And there you have it. That's the wife's lament. Either you can treat it as a lament or as a riddle. Tomorrow I'll post a video about another poem called The Wanderer. And in that case, I'm going to stick to just strictly one translation. Okay? And we're going to treat that as an apocalypse. So I'll have the apocalypse theme open up the criteria for that, and we'll go over the poem itself. As always, hope you're being safe. Drop me a line if you have any questions. Talk to you later.